couple months ago, I presented at the NBA Combine for the NBA Strength and Conditioning Association. They gave me a bunch of topics, and one of them, I have to look it up exactly what Willie was giving me as an option, but one of them was high performance for the foot, and that's what I picked. And that 90-minute or whatever, however long it took, is actually going to be the model for T equals R the foot is next. That's the next big thing, if you will. We'll be filming that a little bit after this. So a lot of the framework and the script is already made out. And what I'll talk about here is from there, where I think there was three things specifically for the Achilles that should be considered. And it really was odd because obviously the combine is at a certain time, but that stuff is set up months and months in advance. And there was no exploitation, if you will, of Dame and Halliburton tearing their Achilles. I think most people know that watch my stuff, I'm not that guy. You know, where somebody goes down and then if they did my stuff, this wouldn't happen. I don't, that's just, it's not a message that I enjoy listening to, and certainly I don't believe any of those things. But it was interesting, so there was some dialogue, but you never know what happens with somebody, et cetera, et cetera. So let me talk about the three things. Number one, which I didn't talk a lot about in that situation because it was very, very generally oriented, would be work capacity. Work capacity for an explosive athlete, and what are the local peripheral adaptations in particularly the calf, soleus, foot muscles, et cetera, et cetera. I think while some of the research is very focal, others is more broad, so I don't know that we can really say if certain things happen, that's an injury risk. But I think it stands to reason that people have a propensity to get injured when they're tired. Now, really, what I would really get into is that we do know that as acidosis accumulates, spontaneous electrical activity then begins to dominate. And we know that because if you put a needle into a muscle, spontaneous electrical activity decreases. So we know that better things happen when we decrease SEA, spontaneous electrical activity. So now if you're playing basketball with spontaneous electrical activity because of acidosis, because you have now crossed into this higher cost glycolytic forms of energy production, well then that would then lead to this unique motor strategy that is outside of your dynamical system. To me, that's how good form, good mobility and stability, et cetera, still turns into an injury. I have said, and I will say here, that in my opinion, the number one option, the best opportunity to minimize injuries would be to have elite activity-specific work capacity. Elite performer program, we've talked about all those different things. In this case, we're talking about the peripheral cardiovascular adaptations in the form of mitochondria. But, of course, mitochondria in the calf may not have a lot of value if you don't have mitochondria up the chain, and certainly your central mechanisms would never really be a problem for an NBA basketball player, or really any basketball player. A basketball player that can't get up and down the court because they're gassed, they're not playing basketball. They have to go sit down. You're useless. So I think that first piece, as it relates to soft tissue injuries kind of coming out of nowhere, like an RKO out of nowhere where everything's good and then Randy Orton slaps you, I think that's kind of where this work capacity fits and why you see players looking absolutely perfect and then all of a sudden pop. I think that's a work capacity issue in my opinion. Number two, and of course this is the one that everybody likes to talk about in this entirely reductionist fashion, which, well, the tissue couldn't tolerate the load, or the resiliency. Look, that is not false, but like most other statements that are reductionist, they're not completely true. Clearly you could have exceedingly poor work capacity and an incredibly dense and properly stiff Achilles, and it still tears because of the other reason. But clearly, for whatever the amount of force that goes into a tissue, and if the force exceeds the tolerance of the tissue, yes, of course that is. So always looking at an opportunity to increase the functional or the useful stiffness, maybe density is the right word, of the Achilles is going to be a second goal that we'll talk about, and how do you do that. But I think a lot of the positioning of the actual foot is why people that do a lot of what is correct stimulus for the connective tissue development is not in the correct biomechanical position or the most efficient biomechanical position. And the thing that I think is often missed, whether it is from the hip south, clearly if you have hip limitations, you will have external rotation of the leg when you hit that step back, that false step, and then for whatever other reason south, the foot pronates. Foot pronation is not a problem. Your foot has to pronate. But when you're doing it in that situation and you do not allow for the calcaneus to invert, inverted calcaneus, I think, is a big key that I don't hear a lot of people talking about. Because if you look at the anatomy of the calcaneus and you start to see that it's shaped off a little bit into inversion. So we have to have this action to invert, and then the Achilles and calf line up in this more vertical fashion. It's bowed when you pronate. Now, is the calcaneus remaining everted because the forefoot is in this relative eversion? Sometimes they could be related, sometimes they're not. And then, of course, the big toe, which then would affect the midfoot. So you got to look at all the components of the foot other than just dorsiflexion, and that's the big rock. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of these Achilles, they're not recovering as fast as they want. They're in a pressurized situation where they need to sign before the end of the year, et cetera, and their dorsiflexion is miserable. I'm like, what is going on here? Why are people not looking at this? So the mechanics of the foot, you could always stimulate the tissue for certain adaptations, but can you carry that over without the relative mobility and stability of the foot? Number one, work capacity. Number two, connective tissue. Number three, mechanics of the foot. That's going to be a big piece of what we talk about in T equals R, the foot. And I think you could take those concepts and kind of plug and play in other areas of the body as a way to take those core values and then try to make sense of it somewhere else in the body.